All right, well, we're going to jump into part 7. Yes, we've been doing this series for 7 weeks. We didn't really think through how long this series is going to end up having to be. When we decided actually to change to having a community Sunday, the first Sunday of a month, it kind of threw off the teaching schedule that we had set up and the series schedule that we had set up. So this series was actually going to be a 6-week series. We were like, we have these 2 weeks that we still have between now and our next thing that we're going to start. And do we do a 2-week series? Do we just do individual messages? Well, you don't get tired of talking about happiness, do you? Let's just keep talking about happiness. There are plenty of ways that we can be happy. We didn't hit all 6 of them. There are not just 6 ways to be happy. There aren't just 6 considerations for happiness. So we were happy to continue talking about happiness for 2 more weeks. So if you're thinking this is the series that never ends, I promise you it will end eventually, but your happiness doesn't have to. Anyway, we started this series 6 weeks ago. If you're interested in going back and catching up on what we've talked about up until this point, you can find those messages as well as our other messages on YouTube, on our channel there by searching for Key City Church. But the whole reason we're doing this series and the reason we're so excited about it is obviously because who doesn't want to be happy? But more fascinating than that to us is the fact that as happiness-seeking creatures, as people, as beings that are seeking happiness, that seem to be driven towards most things by a desire to be happy because we believe that the things that we actually desire or are moving towards will make us happy. As happiness-seeking creatures, we know this. We are terrible predictors of what actually makes us happy. And when we just pause and look backwards over our lives, so often we see that the moments in our lives where we were pursuing happiness, so often that pursuit of happiness ended up undermining or actually sabotaging our own happiness. That somehow, for some reason, we're just terrible predictors of what actually makes us happy. And so the curious question that's been driving this conversation is, why are we such poor predictors of what actually makes us happy? And what can we do? What can we do differently to be better predictors or to be more happy? And so that's what we've been doing, is we've defined happiness each week, just so that we're all talking about the same thing, because we could define happiness differently. But the way that we've been defining it is that happiness is happiness, and I know you're not supposed to use the word and the definition of the word, but we're doing it anyway. Happiness in your life that your day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, tends emotionally towards the end of the spectrum that we would identify as happiness, that we're happy in our lives, and it's happiness with our lives. When we pull back and look at our lives, we're happy with what we're doing, we're happy with where we're going, we're happy just generally and broadly with our lives. And we've recognized week to week that we know that happiness is very different from person to person. There are a lot of individual factors that contribute to our capacity for happiness and how we experience happiness. And we want to appreciate and recognize all of those things. And so we're not making a broad blanket statement that this is the happiness path that will work exactly the same for exactly every single person. But we do simultaneously recognize that there's just some conclusions and some observations that we can make about happiness that tend to be true for most people most of the time. And last week we made a little bit of a shift, because before last week, we'd primarily been talking about the things that we don't have and want, that so often we make our happiness contingent on things that we don't have and want, whether that's possessions or it's title or it's approval or it's affirmation, things that we find ourselves lacking and want. We also recognized last week, as we kind of shifted our focus, we shifted because we recognized when we talk about happiness, that's not always the case for everybody. That for a lot of people, when the topic of happiness comes up, our minds might not go to what we don't have and want, but in fact, our minds might actually go towards what we do have and don't want, the things in our lives that seem to get between us and happiness that we all things being equal, would just rather not be there at all. In fact, happiness would be so easy, it seems, if we could just take those things out of our lives. And that's what we talked about last week. We talked about the challenges and the struggles, conflict and the difficulties in our lives and how those so often seem to stand between us and happiness. And we discovered that so often those are the things that actually, as difficult as they are in the moment, they expand and grow and stretch our capacity to experience a greater level of happiness, the things that are in our lives we don't really want there. And so this week, we're going to dig in a little bit more on the topic of things that are in our lives that we just rather weren't there, that seem to stand between us and happiness. And the thing that I want to zero in on today is the thing that maybe for some of you most of the time, definitely for most of you some of the time, tends to be the thing that maybe is even how you would answer someone if they asked you about your life. It might be like the one-word answer that you would give when somebody asks you how things are going. That tends to define your life maybe much of, if not most of the time. In fact, when people say, "How's your life?" other than fine, this tends to be the answer that I get from people most of the time because it defines our life so succinctly, and it's this, that our lives are busy. And so often what stands between us or seems to stand between us and happiness is busyness. We're just busy. And when people ask you how you are, you're busy. And how are the kids? They're busy. And how's work? It's busy, right? We're busy. Our lives are busy. Work's busy. Our kids are busy. We're very busy. And if you've had this experience, you know what this is like. You just wake up in the morning and the first thing you have are emails waiting for you and text messages that you need to respond to. And then you hurry up and you get your kids ready for school and you get yourself ready for work and you hustle out the door and you forgot 5 things that you have to go back to for and get. And then you're running late and you have to get them dropped off at school and you're late for work. And then everything at work just interrupts the things that you had planned for the day. And you get to the end of your work day and look back at the things that you were supposed to get done. You didn't get any of them done. You're like, what was I doing all day? I don't know, but I was busy. And you have to meet the kids at home and get dinner ready and get them ready for bed. And there's a thing that you were supposed to do in the evening that you meant to do, but you couldn't get to it because something else came up. And you get to the end of your day and you look back at the whole thing. You're like, what did I get done today? Like, I don't know, but I was busy. I was busy the whole time, and I get to the end of my weekends. I get to Sunday, and people ask me, what'd you do this weekend? I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. I was busy the whole time, but I have no idea what I actually did. We're busy. And so often, in the midst of busy seasons in life, when life just gets busy, so often, happiness just isn't even on the radar. If somebody says, are you happy? I'm like, I don't know. I'm busy. I don't know if I'm happy. I'm too busy to know if I'm happy. We're just busy. And here's what happens. When we're busy, our tendency, your tendency, my tendency, when we're busy, and you know this, you just haven't sat down and made this list because you're too busy, but our tendency when we're busy is, number one, we prioritize what is urgent. Right? We just prioritize what is urgent. What is urgent tends to be anything with a timestamp, right? Anything that has an arrival time, anything that has a timeline, anything that has a deadline, like anything that is time-stamped becomes urgent. That we have to be here by this time, that's urgent. This has to be in by this date, that's urgent. That we tend to prioritize what is urgent. Number two, we give attention to what is apparent. The things that are apparent get our attention. If it has a flashing light, it gets our attention. If it buzzes and makes a noise, it gets our attention. A notification shows up on our phone, it gets our attention. The dash light on the car gets our attention. The dishes in the sink get our attention. The flat tire on the car gets anything that's apparent gets our attention. We know this. And lastly, we value what's convenient, that the more busy we become, the more we value what is convenient. And what is convenient is, how can I get the same output with less input, right? Because the more I can get the same output with less input, the more stuff I can cram into my life, right? Because if I can get the same output with less input, I can multitask. Like, I can listen to, my phone, read my emails while I work out. I can get 2 things done at once, and get the same benefit from both of them, right? It allows us to do more things. And there are a lot of things in our lives that we're always looking for. How can I do this with either less time, less energy, or less attention? How do I do this with less time, less energy, and less attention? Because then I can get more things into my day. Now, we could make an argument. An argument could be made for the fact that we just need to make our lives less busy, that we need to declutter our lives. Like, absolutely, absolutely. And we could talk about that. And we could talk about looking at our lives and the things that we're stacking up in our lives and prioritizing things and identifying what needs to stay and what needs to go in order to declutter our lives. And absolutely, absolutely. We should probably do a series on that sometime, and we just might. I think we should. But I'm not going to convince you tonight to declutter your life. I'm not going to convince you in the next 30 minutes that there is anything in your life that you can afford to cut out, because if I could, you'd have already cut it out. So that is not the argument we're going to make tonight, because what we also recognize, we recognize that sometimes life is just busy. There's just busy seasons in life, that our life just gets full. And it's not unimportant things, it's not bad things. It can be good things and important things. And a lot of times it's things that we don't even have control over. There's just times and seasons when life gets busy. And the question is, can we still find happiness in the midst of those seasons of busyness that we can't unbusy? And I would suggest that it is accessible. And I would also suggest that maybe what stands between us and happiness isn't busyness, but the tendencies that we have when we get busy. That what stands between us and happiness in busy seasons is what we prioritize and what we give our attention to and what we find ourselves valuing in seasons of busyness. And the things that we prioritize and get our attention, and the things that we end up valuing, often cause us to overlook the things that actually bring us and bring you happiness. Because here's what I'd suggest even further. What will bring you happiness in your busy life, when everything's clamoring for your attention, where alarms are going off and things are flashing and everybody's expecting something from you, what will actually bring you happiness in those seasons is rarely urgent, is rarely apparent, and is almost never convenient. And so then how do we prioritize things? How do we identify the things to make sure to stay focused on if they're not urgent and if they're not apparent and if they're not convenient? How do we do that when we're busy? Maybe this question. How do we prioritize what we prioritize, value, and give attention to? Like, how do I identify those things? Now, how interesting would it be to be able to sit down with Jesus and ask that question? To ask Jesus the question, what do I prioritize my life? What do I make sure to keep first when life gets busy? Like, what's the thing that I need to make sure stays on top? To be able to ask Jesus, who walked onto the pages of history 2,000 years ago, who claimed to be God in flesh, who invited people to put their complete trust and faith not in God, but in Him as God in flesh, who offered eternal life to people. And when everybody thought that He was crazy, told everybody, I will prove it, because I'm going to be killed, and then 3 days later, I'm going to rise from the dead. And then just so happened to pull it off. And if you know somebody who predicted and pulled off their own death and resurrection, you might want to ask them the same question. But in the meantime, wouldn't it be fascinating just to hear or have a conversation with Jesus and allow Him to answer this question, have this kind of conversation about what do we put first in our busy lives? In the midst of busyness, we can still find happiness. As you may have guessed, Jesus just so happened to have this exact conversation 2,000 years ago. It was recorded by one of the eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus, a man named Mark. Mark, who saw this conversation, who heard this conversation, and wrote this conversation down and included it in his account of the life of Jesus. And then Mark passed that account of the life of Jesus off to the early church. The early church found it so valuable and so meaningful, and so they did with it whatever we do when we have something that we don't want to lose because it's so valuable. They slid it into their Bible. And then it just got passed down, and it's been in our Bible ever since. So you can find the account of Jesus' life written by Mark in the New Testament portion of our Bible. And in that account, we find Jesus having a conversation, teaching a group of people. In the middle of that teaching, someone raises their hand to ask Jesus the question that we're all wondering. And it's this: of all the commandments, which is the most important? Out of all the commandments, there are 613 commandments in the Jewish scriptures. And so the guy's asking, like, out of all this is a lot of commandments, like day to day. It's hard to keep track of 613 things. Like, Jesus, you're claiming to be the Son of God of anybody. You should be able to boil this down and make it simple and applicable. In the midst of all of this, what's the most important thing? Which is what we'd kind of like to know. In the midst of our busy, hurried lives that we live most of the time and fast forward, just trying to catch what we can, prioritize what seems urgent, apparent, and convenient. In the midst of that and everything clamoring for our attention, what should we be making sure to prioritize? And most of you know how Jesus responds. Jesus says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. With the Lord your God. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because for a lot of this, we love this verse. This is a refreshing verse because we love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. But I recognize for others of us, this may feel like a heavy verse. And not heavy because your struggle is over whether or not God exists. It's not over whether or not, Scripture's believable. It's not over like 7-day creation. But your struggle is the burden, the feeling of a burden to love a God that you might not particularly like. And if that's you, here's what I would just suggest. What if the God that you find difficult to like, the God that maybe you've been turned off by but still feel like you have to love, that maybe you feel burdened to love, what if the God that you find difficult to like isn't an issue with who God is? What if it's an issue with the version of God that was presented to you? The version of God that you were handed. A version of God that was represented to you. A version of God that you inherited in the version of faith that you grew up in. But what if that version of God isn't what God's actually like? And what if Jesus actually came, as he claimed, to show us exactly what God is like? That our God is a God who came to us, who came for us, who welcomed sinners, who only ever used his powers to heal, restore, provide, and protect, who allowed his own creation to nail him to a cross without lifting a finger in retaliation against them, to prove to all of creation that he loves us, that he is a God who is for us and will always be a respecter of our freedom because he truly wants our very best and he wants us to discover it freely, and he's inviting us into it. That our God is a God who truly, completely, and fully loves people. Now, if that were the God that actually existed, wouldn't you like a God like that? I mean, if you strip away all the baggage that's maybe been attached to the version of God that was presented to you, I mean, wouldn't you love a God who loves people? Wouldn't you like a God like that? And wouldn't it follow that you would just want to follow a God like that? And this is where Jesus is going. It's like, if that's what God is actually like, wouldn't you like a God like that and want to become like that? And because of that, there's a second part to this. Not only love the Lord your God, but the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandment greater than these. Now, Jesus is taking love God and love people and saying these are two parts of the same whole. You can't separate these. That when you see who God truly is, that our God is a God who loves people, a God who cares about people, a God who came to serve people. When you love a God like that, you can't help but to become someone who also loves people. When you worship that kind of God, when you focus on that kind of God, when you follow that kind of God, when you study that kind of God, and when you love that kind of God, you can't help but become someone who loves people. And so Jesus said, you can't unhinge these things. They're two sides of the same coin. The greatest commandment, singular, is love God by loving others. This is the most important thing. And in other passages, Jesus said all of the rest of the laws hang on these two commands. That these two commands are at the pinnacle of what God is doing in the universe, and everything else is application. So when it comes to what is most important has to rise to the top of the list no matter how busy you get, is love God by loving others. And to really drive this home, to make sure his disciples understood this clearly, the night before Jesus would go to the cross, he's sitting around the table with his disciples, getting them ready for what is going to happen next. And he tells them, a new command I give you, a new command, singular, I give you, love one another. To which they'd say, well, that's not new. You've said that like a million times, Jesus. What do you mean that's new? It's not new. And Jesus would say, I'm not through. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. Jesus said, remember how I loved? You remember over the past 3.5 years, remember how I loved? Remember when we were going like from city to city and there are all these places that we were trying to get to, and you always felt like we were in such a hurry because we were trying to get from town to town. And then people would come along that needed to be healed, people who were sick, people who were hurt. Remember what we did? They were like, yeah. We always slowed down. I mean, we had places we were going to get. We had people we were trying to get to, but you would always slow down for everybody who just came up along the way. Jesus is like, yeah, we always slowed down. Remember how I loved? Remember how I loved when we were on our way because there was that girl that they came to us because this girl was sick and she was dying and they were so worried and they were so upset. They came and they got us. They're like, yeah, we remember. She's like, remember what happened? We were on the way to help her and to heal her. They're like, yeah, we went through the crowd and you stopped. Like we were on the way to heal someone who was dying and you just stopped. Like we were so frustrated, Jesus. Like we had to get there and you stopped because someone touched your cloak. Are you kidding me? She said, yeah. Remember? We slowed down for the person who had the need right in front of us. Remember how I loved you? Remember how I loved you? Remember when we were teaching the crowds all day and we'd been out in the sun all day and it was so hot and we were so tired and it was the end of the day and everybody just wanted to get home because they were so hungry. Remember, they're like, yeah. And we were like, send them to their homes so they can eat. It's the end of the day. We have places to be. She's like, yeah, remember what we did? And they're like, yeah. We sat down and we had a meal together. He's like, yeah. We slowed down to meet the need. It was right in front of us. Remember how I loved you. Remember when we were on our way to Jerusalem and we had to get there before the Passover? And you guys were just so like, we got to get there. And I was like, yeah, we do. Remember what happened? They're like, yeah, that short guy in the tree named Zacchaeus. Like, you stopped and didn't just say, hey, don't forget, God loves you. Let's move on our way. Like, we stayed with him. Like, we were on our way to get somewhere and you decided to stay with the tax collectors. He's like, yeah, remember? We slowed down for the person right in front of us. Remember how I loved you guys. Remember how we slowed down. And then Jesus drive this home because they're probably wondering like, my gosh, like this love thing, like love one another. Like why? As Jesus went on, he would explain to them, here's why this matters. I have told you this so that my, joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. I am inviting you into my way of love. I'm inviting you to love like I love, because when you do, your joy, your happiness, that thing that you are running after, that you're expecting to find at the end of every road you go down, that happiness is found when you follow me in my way of love. And so, my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. And Jesus had made it so clear to his followers, so clear, that after his death, resurrection, and ascension, they carried it on. We find a follower of Jesus named Paul. Some years later, Paul, who had been a persecutor of followers of Jesus until he met the resurrected Jesus, and then Paul became a follower of Jesus and planted communities of followers of Jesus throughout the Roman Empire. And in one of those letters, Paul writes to them to remind them of what Jesus had placed eminent importance upon. Because within that community, there was division and fighting and back and forth. And Paul's like, let's re-baseline back to what truly matters. And Paul says, listen, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm just a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I'm nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I've gained nothing. That in the midst of our busy, hurried lives that we find ourselves living and fast forward, trying to get what we can as we go along. Paul's saying, listen. You can get all the stuff. You can get all the accolades. You can get all the things. You can respond to all the texts. You can answer everybody's questions and do all this stuff. But listen. If you miss out on love, you've missed the whole thing. If you've missed love, if you do all that without love, you have nothing. And if you asked a happiness researcher what matters most in life, what is most correlated to happiness, they would say the same thing. In fact, in a Harvard study that Harvard University did, it was one of the longest studies done longitudinally over human life that's ever been done. They did a study of over 700 lives over the course of 75 years. And the question that they were asking, they would send surveys like monthly to these over 700 participants over 70 years. And they were asking, what is it that actually makes people happy? Like, what is most correlated to happiness? And so they took these lives that were just so diverse over economic strata, people with different incomes, people who went through such different circumstances with different jobs and different, some of them had faced hardships, some of them faced challenges, some of them had great opportunities, some of them had, terrible losses, like all of these different lives. And as they went along, they were correlating, like, what is going on in these people's lives that we can find a correlation between commonalities and people who are actually feeling happiness? And it was so fascinating. They were looking for top 10, but what they found is there's just one. There's one, this is one, rises to the top, and everything else that's correlated to happiness is so far behind it, it doesn't even matter. There's just this one that always rises to the top, no matter the person's challenges, no matter their job, no matter their education level, no matter the challenges or opportunities or income that they have, regardless of all other factors, this one always rose to the top as being correlated to happiness. And you know what it is. It was meaningful relationships. Meaningful relationships. That the greatest predictor of your happiness is the meaningfulness of your relationships now. That if you want to track lead measures and lag measures in your life, and all you wanted to optimize for was happiness, then their research says invest in meaningful relationships. If you want to drive your happiness, invest in meaningful relationships. And we know this. We know this. This is like the punchline of every movie, right? It's people that matter. It's our relationships that matter. We get this. And simultaneously, we live on the brink of what researchers predict is going to be a loneliness epidemic. That as much as we recognize relationships are important, we live in a culture that's self-reported as one of the loneliest that's ever been. And in a time where we are more connected than we've ever been before, we are lonelier than we've ever been before. Why is a culture where we're surrounded by people? Why is a culture where we have connection all the time in our pocket? Why is a culture like that so lonely? And when you look at the research, and you look at the trends, and you look at the commonalities, and you tie them back to root sources, you know what it comes back to more frequently than anything else? Busyness and distraction. Busyness and distraction. Busyness and distraction. We can be around people all day, but it doesn't mean anything if we're busy, distracted. We can be physically present with someone, but not have connection if we're too busy or too distracted. Busyness and distraction. That while we are around people and we are connected more than we've ever been before, we're busier and more distracted than we've ever been before. Busyness. Busyness. Because busyness causes us to prioritize what is urgent, to give attention to what is apparent, and to value what is convenient. And your relationships, and you know this, the relationships that you have in your life are rarely any of those things. Rarely is there a deadline on your relationship. Rarely is the relationship saying, this is going to fall apart if you don't do this by this date. It's there, but we don't know it, and we don't see it coming until it's too late, right? Rarely are the needs in your relationship apparent. You can't see them. There's not a light flashing. You know why? Because the people in your life know that you're busy, and they respect that. And they don't want to bother you, and they don't want to burden you. So they're not going to ask you for more than you can give. But guess what? The need's there. It's just not apparent. And rarely ever are relationships convenient. Rarely can you get by in a relationship by giving less time, less energy, and less attention, right? You can't do a relationship on fast forward. You can't go through the customs and expect a relationship to last. You can't do a relationship on fast. You can't multitask a relationship. A relationship, connection with another human being takes time and attention and energy. And you can't just fast forward past it. When we get busy, this is what we focus on, but our relationships, your relationships are rarely any of these things, which is why I think Paul, who just gave us that description of love and said, you can have everything else, but if you miss out on love, you've missed it all. It's why I think Paul starts his next section about love, where he's going to break down what love is and what love isn't. He starts at the very top of the list. It's like, if you miss this, like the rest of it, it's just not going to matter. Paul starts the list off with this. He says, love is patient. Love slows down. You can't love and fast forward. You can try to do relationships fast. You can try to breeze through it, but that's not how love works. That's not how connections work. That's not how human beings were wired. Jesus is like, I should know. Right? Paul's like, listen, love is patient. The love that Jesus is inviting you into, that he's inviting us into, slows down for the who right in front of you. The kind of love that Jesus said, this is the greatest commandment. The greatest commandment, love, is patient. It slows down. You can't speed past it, and if you do, you're going to miss it. And not only are you going to miss the relationship, but you're going to miss the things that God has put in front of you that are ultimately going to make you the happiest. And we know this. Oh my gosh, we know this. I know this. Oh my gosh, I know this. Oh, but it's so hard to do because we're so busy. And listen, this message is a message that I wrote for myself. And I've really just invited you guys to listen to me give this message to myself, because this is my thing. And if this just happens to resonate with you, then I'm really glad for that. But primarily, this is for me, because I recognize this showing up in my life. I recognize in the busyness and the hustle of life, I know what I'm supposed to say in a relationship. When Monica tells me about her day, I know what I'm supposed to say in response before I've even said it, before she's even finished saying her part. And it's so easy for just to become accustomed. It's when you finish saying that, I'll say my words, and you say your words, and then I'll say my words, and then we love each other, and I walk away, right? I mean, you do. You know what you're supposed to say. But you don't connect. And the other person might not even know it, but they feel it. They feel it. Because love has to slow down. You can't do love quick. A mentor of mine told this story about a season of his life when he was so busy, and his daughter came in. Said, Dad, can I tell you about my day? He said, yeah, but you're going to have to tell me quick because I have a lot of things I need to get done. She said, I'll come back when you can listen slow. Because the love that Jesus is inviting us into is a love that slows down. It gets slow for the who that's right in front of you. And I know what it is to listen to my kids tell me a story, and I already know how the story's going to go. And in my mind, I'm solving the problem at work. Right? I'm thinking through, how are we going to sequence this and prioritize this and explain it to the client? That's where my mind is. And I already know what I'm going to say at the end of the story. It's all prepackaged. I know how to do this, but I haven't. But when I do that, I don't connect with them. I don't connect. And I miss out on the love that Jesus is inviting us into. When you're at the checkout line at the grocery store, You've been on your phone because you've been waiting in line. What else would you do? I mean, you're not going to be one of those weirdos who just stands there and doesn't do anything, right? You're not going to be that guy. I'm that guy, but you wouldn't be. I mean, you're going to be looking at your phone. And then you have to do like the courteous exchange with the checkout person. They say thank you, or you say thank you, and they say you're welcome. And you just this exchange, but it's just so formal that you're not actually with that person. You don't actually see them. There's no connection there. And this is what researchers say we're largely missing out on, is that our interaction with just people in life, just as we're going through life. In fact, they did this study, and they had people actually, they said, we want you to say hi to someone during your commute into work. And everybody predicted how it would make them feel beforehand, and they reported on how it made them feel afterwards. And beforehand, they reported what we'd all report. That's weird and awkward. Right? Or at least what I would report. That's weird and awkward. I don't want to do that. And then they would do that, and they would report, looking back on it, that actually made me happier. A large part of our loneliness is just walking through life without actually connecting with the people around us. And then love that Jesus is inviting you into, the love that Jesus is inviting me into, is a love that's willing to slow down and be present with the who that's right in front of you. Because that's where connection happens. That's where relationship is built. And ultimately, it's what forms us and molds us into who God is creating us to be. It's never urgent. It's never apparent. It's never convenient. But Jesus said it's what's most important. And if you want to be happy, in spite of all you have to do, slow down. Just be willing to slow down for the who right in front of you. Like we've said throughout this series, that we're not just interested in knowing how to be happy, we actually want to be happy. So every week we've identified, like, what is just a micro practice that we can slide into our lives that doesn't drastically disrupt our Monday to Saturday living because we're busy people? Like, what is just a small thing that slides into our busy lives that we can try this on for size and see, does it really turn out the way that Jesus promises? And so here's a micro practice that you might try this week. I invite you to. And all it is just to become aware of your presence when someone is seeking your attention. To become aware of, am I present with this person? Just to notice. That's it. Just notice. And if you find that you're not, if you find that you're thinking about problems ahead, or you're thinking about what you're going to say in response, or you have your phone out and you're just kind of checking through, you're just scrolling through and listening to them at the same time. If you find yourself doing that, here's what I'd invite you to do. Just take one breath and remind yourself to slow down for the who in front of you and just be present. That's it. That's it. Just notice when you're not present with the who. Just take a breath and remind yourself to be present with the who. That's all you have to do. And if you really want to go a step further and get extra credit with God, I mean, He's keeping score after all. I'm just kidding. He's not. If you want to take it a step forward, I'd invite you at the end of your day, as you're laying in bed and going to sleep, I encourage everybody to have a practice of gratitude, but just slide in a moment of gratitude at the end of the day and just recount those moments where you were able to be present. And just be thankful for those moments. Bottle them up. Bottle up those memories. I'm telling you, that in the midst of your busyness, you can find happiness. So, like we've said all along throughout this whole series, what makes you happy? And as we've said all along, there is no thing outside of you that you can get or that you can do that is going to make you happy. That what makes you happy, well, it's you. You do. You have the power over your attention. You have the power over your habits. You have the power over what you focus on and think about. You have power over the things that will ultimately make you happy. You are empowered to go out and be happy. You do. Makes you happy? You do. When you slow down for the who right in front of you. I'm so glad that you guys chose to join us this evening. I hope this was helpful or just a good reminder of things that you already know. I know that for me, this is something that I always need to be reminded of. I hope that we see you back next Sunday. Next Sunday, I promise, will be our last Sunday of what makes you happy, and we'll talk one more time about what makes you happy. But until then, will you guys pray with me? Father, we are so grateful for you, so grateful for the example that you set for us in Jesus, showing us the kind of love that you're inviting us into, a love that no matter how much is on our plate, no matter how much is clamoring for our time and attention, a love that is capable of just slowing down and being present with people that you care about, people that you love, people who carry the image of your divinity within them. Give us the spirit, give us the courage to give them the attention and the presence that they deserve, that ultimately fills our heart with the joy that makes us complete. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.